Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jonathan Ahl. Leading a college or university is becoming a more and more challenging job. Tenures are getting shorter, and some leaders in our area are stepping down or moving on. Just last week, both Harris-Stowe State University President Dwaun Warmack and Washington University Provost Holden Thorp announced they're leaving their posts. And WashU Chancellor Mark Wrighton and University of Missouri St. Louis Chancellor Tom George are both retiring. Michael Shonrock of Lindenwood University and James Dennis of McKendree University are both leaving as well. Joining me on Friday afternoon to help make sense of this trend and others within the field of higher education were three guests who have been watching it all very closely. They include Stephen Hansen, Emeritus Professor, Dean and former Interim Chancellor of Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville; Chris Maples, Interim Chancellor at Missouri University of Science and Technology in Rolla; and Sarah Brown, a senior reporter with the Chronicle of Higher Education. I started by asking Sarah whether the U.S. is generally seeing an inordinate amount of turnover in campus leadership right now.
Yes. So in general, the tenure of college presidents is getting shorter. The most recent data we have, which is from the American Council on Education, that's the big higher education association, says that the average tenure of a president now is 6.5 years. That's down from 8.5 years a decade ago. And more than half of the survey respondents said they plan to step down within 5 years. So presidents' time on campus is definitely getting shorter. There are a lot of reasons for that, and we can go into them. But, quite frankly, it's a tough job. You've read the news. You've seen the scandals, college admissions, sexual abuse, athletics. It makes for a very stressful leadership role.
Well, let's talk about maybe what do you think are you ticked off a few possibilities there, Sarah, but what do you really think are the biggest issues that are leading to this reduction in tenure?
So that American Council on Education survey also asked presidents about that, and their number one concern is money. You have to keep your university on sound financial footing in a tough time these days. And, in the Midwest, student populations are on the decline. That means that budgets are tight. In addition to that, presidents these days are responding to issues increasingly that they may not have been dealing with before. So say a professor makes a comment in class that offends a student, the student videotapes the interaction, it goes viral online. The president is going to have to respond to that, right? So there's just a lot of pressures related to the job. It requires presidents to carry out a lot of responsibility, and it's not just about managing a complex organization. So, whether or not that was sort of at play in any of the cases in the St. Louis region, obviously presidents leave for all sorts of reasons. Those are some of the sort of stressors that are leading presidents and chancellors to depart maybe sooner than they would have liked around the country.
Chris Maples, you're just finishing up a 2-year interim chancellorship at Missouri University of Science and Technology. You have a long career in higher education. What's your take on the state of leadership and tenure in America's higher education?
Well, I think Sarah hit it very well. The tenure has been shortening, and the stressors have been increasing somewhat. A lot of it is financial. She's correct. Particularly in public higher education, as states tend to disinvest in some of the public higher education support, more and more universities are scrambling for additional tuition revenue without just increasing tuition all the time. And so what you're finding a lot of universities that are trying to look for that balance between the revenue coming in with tuition, additional revenue with fundraising, additional revenue with creative opportunities for things like online education, for grants, contracts, for intellectual property, and really trying to do all of this in an atmosphere where as social media increases and the use of it has increased over time, the things that you do become more and more out there more and more quickly. And so you don't get a lot of time to think about reactions. You have to already be prepared to deal with incidences on your campus and the news that travels by social media so quickly with that.
Steve Hansen, you are retired, but you were a former interim chancellor and been a professor and a dean. Is our expectations of university leadership fair?
That's a good question. I think Chris and Sarah have articulated the issues really well. What surprised me when I stepped into the role of being interim chancellor was the speed, the direction, the breadth of which issues came at me as chancellor, and how many interests collided in that office, whether it's the interests of the trustees or political interests or faculty interests or student interests. There's so many different sides to the issues and their complexity. And what I found very quickly was that every decision I made had a consequence that more than likely might be against somebody else's interest. So mediating all of that and keeping the friction down was a full-time job. When you add, I think, the stress of social media and how a chancellor or president's already kind of in a glass house, but when you add social media, that every move that you make could be recorded, that makes it even all the more delicate. Yeah, we expect a lot from a chancellor, but or a president. But I don't think it's. I don't want to say unreasonable, but it's the sign of the times, I think, and it requires you to be agile and very careful.
Do you think that we're doing higher education a disservice by having demands on these positions that are so difficult that it makes it almost impossible for somebody to have a 10 or 15-year tenure at one institution? Are we doing higher education a disservice by not allowing or not having people in leadership position for longer periods of time?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know about answering that question. There seems to be, back in the early 20th century, you talked about gentlemen scholars leading universities, and the whole focus seemed to be on educating students. Well, that no longer seems to be the case. A chancellor and a president has to focus on funding, as Chris and Sarah have already indicated. And you have to juggle the politics of that, particularly if you're a public university, and all the interference that's associated with that. That draws the leader away from issues of necessarily of quality and of educating students, and pulls you into a whole different arena than what has been true in the past.
Chris, do you think that the demands are unreasonable and that it's difficult for a university to have long-term success if the leadership is under such pressure that it's very difficult for them to stay for more than a few years?
I think the expectations have increased. There's no doubt, but I think what it means is that more and more that university presidents and chancellors used to operate a little on their own, and now it's much more of a team effort with the shared governance within the university structure, but more importantly with a lot of boards and a lot of oversight that comes in with outside perspective, and so. It's really become much more of an operation that requires that kind of teamwork in order to be successful in the long run. And so it's a different kind of person doing these kinds of things. And so one of the things that you see is that there's been a decreasing number of provosts who are headed towards presidencies. That used to be the traditional track: dean, provost, president. More and more provosts like the idea of working internally within the university, and don't like all of the external demands that go with a presidency or a chancellorship.
If we think about how higher education has changed maybe in the last 20 years, a couple of things come to mind. From the level of state institutions, state support is down pretty much in all 50 states. There's just less money coming from state governments to help state universities, and they've had to respond with a completely different financial structure and, quite frankly, higher tuition. There's also the issue that at least has been put out there by some people, that the value that we're putting on higher education may not be as high as it's been in the past. That there was a much stronger belief that, the way that you are successful in life is you graduate from high school, you go to college, you get a job, as a better, well-rounded human being who can think in a lot of different ways. And there's, politically, socially, that assumption has been challenged. I'd like a reaction from all three of you. Do you believe that that's true? Is higher education under attack at some level in the United States?
Yes, I think so. I think it's under attack from a variety of directions. There is tremendous pressure on universities because they're economic engines in their regions or in the nation. So there's a lot of demand on that side. There's the expectations of parents and students, and if that's not met, with the credentialing of a student who receives a degree, that's pressure. And of course, then there's the universities have been used, and we're at fault ourselves for partisan purposes, for different political agendas. You can see that is being played out today.
I'll jump in. So without taking a explicit position on whether colleges are under attack, there's no question that their value has been brought into question. At the same time, I think it is clear, and I think most people continue to hold this view, college is really important, right? So maybe not necessarily going to college, but getting some kind of post-secondary credential, getting some kind of education after high school is critical to better economic fortunes, better health outcomes, all that kind of stuff. And I think there does continue to be widespread belief that college or some kind of post-secondary something or other is important, but there's no doubt that in some circles there are questions being raised about the value of college and about college costs and all that kind of stuff, and it remains to be seen sort of how colleges and universities will respond to that.
Sarah, in your reporting and in your understanding of it, to what extent is what you just said manifesting itself in the way that university leadership is hired, retained, and how they function in the job?
College leaders are being brought in from different backgrounds. Increasingly, I think that's fair to say. There was sort of a trend a few years ago of bringing in the quote-unquote non-traditional college leader who was more of a business-savvy person, knew how to do more with money, knew how to raise money. So that's certainly a trend we've seen. Historically, college presidents and provosts were both sort of plucked from the academic ranks, the faculty ranks. But in general, we're still seeing kind of a range of people coming into presidencies and a range of people being successful in them.
We'll take a quick break, and you're listening to St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
And welcome back to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jonathan Ahl. I'm speaking with Steve Hansen, an emeritus professor, dean, and former interim chancellor at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. Chris Maples, Interim Chancellor at Missouri University of Science and Technology, and Sarah Brown, a senior reporter with the Chronicle of Higher Education. Chris, I'd like to ask you, you were an interim chancellor in Rolla for 2 years. What do you make of this whole idea of trying to advance a university in a long-term way, even though you may not be there for a short amount of time? And that can manifest itself differently if you are an interim chancellor the way you were, or if it was someone who may only be there for 4 or 5 years, which is kind of considered closer to average tenure.
Well, Sarah's point's a good one, that some of the longer-term goals can fall by the wayside if there's a change in leadership, especially if that change in leadership then brings in a completely different perspective. That's where having broader strategic plans, and so there's a University of Missouri System strategic plan, and one that Missouri S&T has put together itself within the construct of that University of Missouri strategic plan. One of the other places where you really find challenges is in fundraising. If you talk to fundraisers and you look at the fundraising successes, the really larger donors and the larger successes are built around visions and cultivation, and those are usually 6, 7, 8, 10-year kinds of relationships that develop. So that's one place that you definitely lose some momentum with change in leadership.
Steve, do you think something needs to change? I mean, we've talked about, the tenures getting shorter and the pressures getting larger. Is it a problem, and do you think something needs to change?
I think that if funding were more stable, if you could count on, whether you're a public or a private, if you could count on a solid base of funding so that there wouldn't be so much pressure to increase tuition, that it would allow you to plan better, to address some of the questions that Sarah and Chris have brought up. You'd be able to plan for the future and do strategic planning more properly, so that you wouldn't take off, say, on chasing an opportunity that might produce more revenue for the institution, that might be overly ambitious. There's nothing worse than expanding your programs and then funding not coming through for that program, and then you're left without sufficient resources to really follow through. So I would say that if we could count on stable funding that didn't saddle students with debt, that maintained accessibility to higher education for students, that would go a long way in stabilizing the fluctuation in the president's and chancellor's tenure.
Chris, do you think something's broken that needs to get fixed?
I think it's certainly a different time and in a different place. The student debt is a huge issue, and that is frankly something that we are going to collectively have to address as tuition has gone up, and the way students support themselves has not been able to change as dramatically as what they see on their tuition bill. So, tuition has gone up higher than the rate of inflation because there's also been a pulling out of funding from various states. And so the burden has shifted to students. And many of our students today are working 2, 3, 4 jobs, borrowing money, dropping in school, dropping out of school, taking a course here and there, and trying to get their way through while accumulating some degree of debt. And that's the part that's going to have to change in some form or fashion. I think the student loan debt in this nation is a critical issue.
I'd like to throw out a...
Yes,
please, Sarah, go ahead.
Can I jump in on
that?
Yes,
please.
So in addition to student debt and student loans, I totally agree that that's got to be a core issue for college leadership. In my reporting, I've generally found over the past few years that presidents need to be student-focused. So not only on student debt and student costs, but also responsive to students, good at talking with students, working with students, committed to issues like student safety and well-being.
Sarah, do you go ahead, Chris.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think in the business of running universities, there are times that we overlook the people who we are there for, and that is the students. And so it's important to talk to students and listen to them and find out what the struggles that they're going through and find out the things that they're interested in.
I'm wondering if a big part of the challenge here is that at a university, everybody who works there thinks that what they do is the single most important thing that the university does. And I think you want that at some level. But if you teach English, you think making sure that every student has a good understanding of Chaucer is really the most important thing a university does. If you work at the library, you think having a good library is the most important thing that a university does. If you work in res life, you think having a comfortable, clean place to live and a safe place to live for students is the single most important thing that a university does. That's got to be, Steve, that's got to be like a darn near impossible thing to navigate.
That's an interesting point. I think it's a good one. And going back to what I said in the beginning about how I was surprised when I stepped into the Chancellor's office that there was this collision of all these interests. Well, what you just described is part of that. That the Director of Housing has his or her interests that they're promoting in the Chancellor's office. And I think what I found, and I'd like to hear what Sarah and Chris have to say about it, but what I found is that it was hard sometimes to keep your balance, that you're bounced between all these interests and pulled in so many different directions. But if you can keep your focus on the value of the institution, that helps you mediate between those interests and helps you as the Chancellor or President show those the people representing those interests that there's a bigger picture that they have to keep in mind.
But isn't that even? I mean, that sounds very good, but that can be a real challenge because just the push and pull between. Is a university's job at educating students to have them well-rounded in a wide variety of things, or is it to get them very specific information and skills for job placement? And that seems to be a push-pull that has been inherent in higher education for decades, but has really come to a head lately.
Yeah, it has, and I think that with the specialization that is going on in the economy and in jobs, there's more of a demand for credentialing and learning, training for specific skills. But that's, in a sense, short-sighted because you have to educate students to learn how to think, to gather information, and to evaluate that information so they can continue to learn after they have their degree. And that's what a baccalaureate degree does, is to help students learn, to learn how to learn.
Sarah, in your perspective, is the shortened tenure of leadership and some of the things that we've been talking about here, is it a symptom of the other problems that we've been talking about more so than a problem in and of itself?
I think that there's a lot going on in higher ed right now, and it is definitely, there is some kind of correlation with turnover and leadership. It's hard to say causation. One other thing I'll note is that, sort of at the institutions in question in the St. Louis area, obviously a couple of them are retiring or leaving after long tenures. Another one is leaving. The president of Harris-Stowe University is leaving to take another presidency. And of course, the situation at Lindenwood University is a little more fraught because the president was fired after less than 4 years. But there are really a range of reasons that college presidents and chancellors do leave, and retiring after nearly 25 years, as Washington University in St. Louis's chancellor has done, is a totally valid reason to leave. So there's a range of issues at play here.
I'd like to wrap up our conversation by asking each of you to give a very short and direct piece of advice to Board of Trustees that are looking to hire a new president or chancellor. What would be the number one thing that you would ask them to keep in mind as they go down this process? Chris, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. I think I would ask any board of trustees to hire somebody who has that student focus, and to hire somebody who is not going to be in their office all the time. And I know that may sound a little odd, but the job of running a campus is much more than being in the office. It's being out on the campus. It's being out in the community. It's an out and about kind of job.
Steve?
That's a good question. I guess, well, I agree with what Chris said. I would tell the trustees, or I'd ask the trustees to make sure that candidate, the person they choose, does not confuse their ego and ambition with that of the institution, that they're not one and the same thing. And that too often I've seen presidents and chancellors fail because they do get that confused. Their ego gets wrapped up with the institution, and so it becomes more of a personal thing instead of what's good for the institution.
Sarah, you get the last word. What would you tell them?
Sure. So in terms of what we've seen related to presidents and chancellors who have perhaps not done so well at their various institutions, I think listening is a really important skill to have. Being a closed-off college leader in this day and age is not only a risk, it's also just not going to be received very well. So that's something that we've seen a lot of. Another point I'll make is we've seen some flare-ups around not having a diverse candidate pool for the top job at institutions. And I think that's something that people are also aware of. So both, gender, race, socioeconomic background, all of that is another thing that I think these days colleges and universities have to be aware of in the hiring process.
That was Sarah Brown, senior reporter with the Chronicle of Higher Education, along with Steve Hansen, emeritus professor, dean, and former interim chancellor of Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville, and Chris Maples, interim chancellor at Missouri University of Science and Technology, discussing the state of higher education in our region. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.